Welcome in, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about everything wrong with the general epistles and how morality becomes surveillance. When a revolution realizes the world isn't actually going to change, it stops looking at the horizon and starts looking at its own members. In the early days of the Christian movement, the message was an explosion of radical possibility. But by the time we reach James, Peter, John, Jude, and Hebrews, the dust is settled, the adrenaline is worn off, and the end of days has missed its deadline. History remembers the general epistles as a unified front of apostolic wisdom. The reality is much messier. They are a collection of high tension, damage control documents written to communities that were starting to fracture, doubt, and most dangerously, ask questions. Instead of answering those questions with clarity, these letters answer with containment. They mark the precise pivot point where morality stopped being about how you treat others and started being about how well you can be watched. In these pages, curiosity is reframed as instability, difference is diagnosed as contamination, and the brotherly love of the Gospels is retrofitted into a conditional contract. You are loved only as long as you are the same. This isn't a guide for spiritual growth, it's a toolkit for community self policing. We are going to look at how these 9 books taught the West how to value purity over people and fear over truth. These letters are often sold as practical wisdom, but they function as a manual for moral surveillance. They represent the moment where faith stopped being a journey and started becoming a checkpoint. Here, the good news is replaced by a high stakes loyalty test. If the law controlled the body and Paul disciplined the mind, the general epistles weaponized the very idea of goodness to ensure no one steps out of line. This is the birth of the spiritual Panopticon, a world where doubt is a disease, suffering is a trophy, and love is only ever a reward for total intellectual submission. If the law controlled behavior, the gospel's mythologized authority, Acts stabilized structure, Paul internalized obedience, then the general epistles weaponized morality to maintain purity and suppress deviation. They emerge at a moment when Christianity is no longer new, no longer unified, and no longer confident that Jesus is returning anytime soon. The communities are disagreeing, the teachers are diverging, and the people are leaving. So these letters do something vital. They redefine goodness as loyalty and difference as danger. They're not about growth, they're about containment. So let's start our journey with the Epistle of James. This is where moral behavior replaces moral reasoning. To unpack James, we have to look at how it shifts the Christian project from an internal transformation to a public performance. In James, the heart is a black box that doesn't matter, only the output does. This creates a culture where righteousness is a high stakes talent show. James is famously the anti Paul. While Paul wrestles with the complex, messy psychology of grace, James enters the room with a clipboard and a checklist. For example, in James chapter 2, verses 14 through 26, he argues that faith without works is dead, using Abraham as an example, but he skips the reasoning, the why behind the action, and focuses entirely on the what. Well, here's the flaw. By failing to resolve how internal belief relates to external action, James leaves the reader in a permanent state of theological whiplash. You are saved by faith, but if your works aren't visible enough, your faith is retroactively declared dead. It's a legalistic trap where the goalposts are always moving. It gives you no ethical framework. As a matter of fact, outcomes are elevated over ethics. James doesn't teach you how to think through a moral dilemma. He just tells you what the correct person looks like. For example, in the taming of the tongue in James chapter 3, he describes the tongue as a restless evil, a fire, and a deadly poison. The flaw here is that he offers no psychological or spiritual tools to manage the root of speech, only a dire warning about the damage of speech. It is management by fear. There is no ethics of communication, only a policy against talking. So let's talk about the psychological impact. When morality is displayed, the self becomes a product. This creates anxiety driven righteousness. Imagine a believer reading James chapter 1, verse 6 through 8, which says that a doubter is like a wave of the sea, double minded and unstable in all that they do. The result of that is you can't afford to have a bad day or a moment of nuance. If you aren't performing stability, you are spiritually defective. Your worth isn't found in being a human being, it's found in being a consistent performer. This leads to frantic treadmill spirituality where you can never stop running because stopping looks like failing. From a sociological perspective, social respectability becomes salvation. In James, the community becomes a jury of peers that polices behavior based on what looks pure. In James chapter 1 verse 27, he defines religion that is pure and undefiled as visiting orphans, widows, and keeping oneself unstained from the world. Morality becomes aesthetic. It's about being unstained, a visual metaphor. This prioritizes social respectability. If you look clean and you do visible charity work, the community validates you. This creates a culture of veneer Christianity. You can be a monster in private as long as your public stains are minimal. Motives are irrelevant because they can't be policed. Only the display counts. In James, morality isn't discerned, it's displayed. To discern is to struggle, to weigh values, and to grow. To display is to put on a costume. James asked for the costume. It doesn't care if the person underneath is actually growing, it only cares that the works look good on the shelf. In James and even Hebrews, doubt is reframed as instability. Now, this is where the general epistles move from policing your actions to policing your internal processing. In James and Hebrews, a question isn't a sign of engagement, it's a sign of structural decay. Doubt is framed as a character flaw. In these texts, faith isn't a journey toward truth, it's a static position that you either hold or betray. The waiver isn't human, it's a malfunction. In James chapter 1, verses 6 through 8, James compares the doubter to a wave of the sea, blown and tossed by the wind. He famously calls them double minded and unstable in all of their ways. James treats the state of mind, doubt, as a moral failure. He doesn't offer more evidence or deeper reasoning to resolve the doubt, he simply shames the doubter for having it. In Hebrews chapter 3, verse 12, the author warns against having an evil, unbelieving heart that turns away from the living God. In this case, the flaw is simply unbelief. By linking unbelief to an evil heart, Hebrews collapses the distinction between intellectual honesty and moral depravity. If you have a question about the theology, the text tells you the problem isn't the logic, it's your soul. When your own mind is framed as a potential traitor, you stop trusting your ability to perceive reality. This creates epistemic insecurity, suppression of honesty. If the stable person never doubts, you learn to perform certainty. Even when you're confused, you become a stranger to your own thoughts because acknowledging them feels like a moral slip. This is an anxiety loop. You begin to doubt your own salvation because you have questions, which creates a paralyzing loop. I have a question. That means I'm double minded. Therefore, I'm unstable. And that means God won't answer me. When enough people are impacted like this leads to protecting fragile structures. A community that punishes curiosity is a community that cannot survive the truth. This is community protection through silencing, rewarding the simple. In these letters, the person who asks the fewest questions is held up as the pillar of the community. Certainty becomes a social currency. Because doubt is seen as instability, the person with questions is viewed as a structural threat, a loose brick that might bring down the whole wall. Now, sociologically, this justifies shunning or marginalizing thinkers to keep the fragile group safe. If you question, the problem isn't the belief, it's you. This is the ultimate gaslighting mechanism of the general epistles. They shift the burden of proof from the message to the messenger. If the message doesn't make sense, these authors don't look for a better explanation, they look for a defect in the person asking why. Now let's talk about obedience through threat of judgment. Here we move from the shaming of the doubter to the terrorizing of the believer. If James is the clipboard wielding inspector, Hebrews is the high voltage fence. It's here that the good news takes on a jagged, threatening edge. The most effective way to control a population is not through clear rules, but through profoundly severe consequences for rules that are never quite defined, like blaspheming the Holy Spirit. In Hebrews chapter 6, verse 4 through 6, and chapter 10, verses 26 through 31, the author famously warns that if you sin deliberately after receiving the truth, there is no longer a sacrifice for sins, only a fearful expectation of judgment and of raging fire. Now, what constitutes sinning deliberately? Is it a stray thought? Is it a moment of doubt? Is it a lapse in performance? The author never specifies. By leaving the threshold of damnation vague, the author ensures the reader is always in a state of spiritual orange alert. You can never know for sure if you've crossed the line, so you overcorrect into total submission. Let's talk about the psychological impact. When the stakes are eternal fire and the criteria are murky, the mind enters a state of hypervigilance. This isn't peace, it's a trauma response. You stop doing things because they are right and start doing them because you are scared. Your internal moral compass is bypassed and replaced by an external threat detection system. The Sabbath rest promised in Hebrews becomes ironic. You cannot rest when you are constantly scanning your own soul for the deliberate sin that might trigger the raging fire. This is control without transparency. It creates a community where power is absolute because it's unfalsifiable, which leads us to punishment being normalized as love. 1 Peter 4:17 claims that judgment begins at the house of God. Hebrews 12:6 argues that the Lord disciplines the one he loves and he chastises everyone he accepts as his son. Now, this reframes hardship or systemic abuse as divine discipline. If the leadership or the community punishes you, it's framed as a sign of God's affection. This makes the power structure unaccountable. If you complain about the discipline, you are essentially complaining about God's love. Hebrews doesn't guide, it warns. A guide helps you find your way. A warning sign just tells you that you're in danger. Hebrews doesn't offer a path for human flourishing, it offers a perimeter for human containment. It replaces the yoke that is easy with a fearful expectation, turning the community into a group of people held together not by a shared vision, but by shared terror. Let's dive a little deeper into First Peter, where suffering is reframed as proof of faithfulness. First Peter takes the hypervigilance of Hebrews and gives it a devastatingly positive spin. If Hebrews uses the threat of pain to keep you in line, First Peter uses the presence of pain to convince you that you're exactly where you need to be. Suffering is framed as a moral asset. First Peter transforms suffering from a problem to be solved into a commodity to be cherished. It's no longer an unfortunate reality of a broken world, it is the primary evidence of divine favor. In 1 Peter chapter 2 verses 18 through 21, the author explicitly tells slaves to submit to their masters, not just the kind ones, but even the harsh ones, arguing that it is commendable if someone bears up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. By moralizing endurance rather than justice, the text divorces morality from any actual improvement of the human condition. It suggests that the holiest response to evil isn't to stop it, but to absorb it. When pain is reframed as virtue, the victim's natural survival instincts, anger, or desire for safety, the setting of boundaries, are reframed as spiritual rebellion. If you're being mistreated, 1 Peter chapter 4 verse 13 tells you to rejoice in as much as you participate in the sufferings of Christ. This creates a psychological bypass. Instead of processing the trauma, the victim filters it through a religious lens that makes the pain feel like a blessing. If bearing up under harsh treatment is the goal, then a boundary, saying no or this is wrong, is seen as a lack of faith. You lose the ability to protect yourself because your holiness is now tied to your openness to being hurt. This is the ultimate employer's manual for an oppressive system. If the subjects believe that their suffering is their purpose, the rulers never have to change. In First Peter, the community doesn't look for ways to escape oppression, they look for ways to be oppressed better. By teaching that judgment begins at the house of God and that the righteous are scarcely saved, that's First Peter chapter 4 verse 17 through 18, the text shifts the focus away from the behavior of the abuser and onto the spiritual purity of the victim. The system remains intact because the victims are too busy rejoicing in their scars to question the hand that gave them the scars. If you're hurting, you must be holy. In the world of First Peter, a lack of suffering is actually a cause for concern. It might mean you aren't in Christ enough to bother the world. This creates a perverse incentive to stay in toxic, high control environments. It turns the church into a place where the person with the most trauma is given the most spiritual authority, provided they never complain about how they got it. Our next stop is that in the epistles, purity language creates moral contamination anxiety. The general epistles move from the internal management of the self to the biological defense of the tribe. We transition from the quiet endurance of First Peter to the aggressive paranoia of Second Peter and Jude. Here, the false teacher isn't just someone with a different opinion, they are a pathogen. Let's talk about the biology of belief here. The language used in Second Peter and Jude is intentionally visceral. It stops being about truth versus error and starts being about clean versus unclean. In Second Peter chapter 2 verses 1 through 3 and verse 22, the author describes dissenting teachers as bringing in destructive heresies and famously compares them to dogs returning to their vomit or pigs returning to the mud. In Jude 12, Jude calls them hidden reefs, clouds without rain, and autumn trees without fruit, and uprooted, twice dead. Notice the lack of actual argument. There is no point by point refutation of what these people are actually saying. Instead, there is a character assassination based on the idea that their very presence is a blot or a stain on the community. When you're taught that wrong ideas are infectious, you develop contamination anxiety. Your morality is no longer based on doing good, but on staying uninfected. If a single false idea can destroy your entire soul, you lose the ability to handle nuance. You stop seeing people and start seeing carriers. You become afraid of reading anything or talking to anyone outside the safe circle because your spiritual health is framed as being so fragile that a single conversation could corrupt you. Let's call that intellectual agoraphobia. This is the birth of the sanitized community. Exclusion is no longer seen as a harsh act, it's reframed as life saving medical intervention. In Jude 22 through 23, the author tells the community to snatch others from the fire, but to show mercy to others mixed with fear, hating even the clothing stained by corrupted flesh. If the dissenter is a disease, then shunning them isn't mean, it's quarantine. This allows the community to treat people with utter cruelty while maintaining a sense of moral superiority. You aren't hurting a brother, you are cleansing the body. In the general epistles, disagreement spreads like disease. By moving the debate from the realm of ideas to the realm of purity, these letters make intellectual growth impossible. You don't argue with the virus, you eradicate it. This creates a community where the highest virtue is sterility, a state where no new ideas can enter and no contaminated people can stay. Now let's talk about First John, where love is conditional. This is where we reach what is perhaps the most sophisticated bait and switch in the New Testament. First John is frequently quoted at weddings and on inspirational posters for its soaring rhetoric about God is love. But when you look at the fine print, that love isn't a gift. It's a contractual obligation contingent on ideological compliance. In the Gospels, love is often portrayed as an expansive, sun like force that falls on the just and the unjust. In First John, love is a border wall. It's the primary tool used to distinguish the children of God from the children of the devil. In First John chapter 4 and chapter 2, the author writes that everyone who loves has been born of God, which sounds beautiful until you read the neighboring verses. He defines the Antichrist as anyone who denies his specific Christology. Love is no longer an action or an affection. It is a diagnostic marker for correct doctrine. If you don't hold the right belief alignment regarding the flesh of Jesus, your love is invalid and you are, by definition, an outsider. When love is tied to belief, your sense of belonging is only as stable as your last theological thought. This creates a state of conditional belonging, the walking on eggshells, because the author insists that perfect love drives out fear, but then immediately lists the criteria for who is out. In First John chapter 2 verse 19, the believer is trapped. You're told to feel loved, but you know that if you start to disagree with the community's specific dogma, that love will be retracted instantly. You learn to suppress any unauthorized thoughts because you know they are the key to your exile. You don't stay because you're loved, you stay because you're afraid of being unloved. First John weaponizes the community's affection to enforce its boundaries. The letter was likely written after a group of people left the community. As in First John chapter 2 verse 19, it says they went out from us, but they did not really belong to us. The response isn't grief or outreach, it's post hoc stripping of their humanity. The author reframes their departure as proof that they never had the love of the Father in them. In this sociological model, loving the brethren means monitoring the brethren's confession. If someone starts to drift, the community doesn't lean in with curiosity, they lean in with concern that is actually a demand for recanting. Love becomes the velvet glove on the iron fist of exclusion. In First John, you're loved as long as you agree. John creates a world where love is the name of the cage. It offers a warm, glowing interior for those who stay inside the doctrinal lines, but it promises a cold, demonic exterior for those who step out. It is the ultimate form of emotional surveillance. You are being watched not just for what you do, but for whether your heart is aligned enough to qualify for affection. And let's not forget that this is also the book where we get the infamous phrase, to love the world is to hate God. I will be doing a whole video on that one. If you've been paying attention so far, you will realize by now that sin has become an identity, not action. First John moves the goalpost of morality from the courtroom to the laboratory. Sin is no longer a crime you commit and can repent for, it's a DNA marker that determines your species. While the Gospels often show Jesus engaging with the gray areas of humanity, First John collapses reality into a stark, neon lit binary. You are either light or darkness. You are a child of God or a child of the devil. There is no middle ground. In First John chapter 3 verse 6 through 9, the author makes a staggering claim. No one who lives in him keeps on sinning. No one who continues to sin has either seen him or known him. He goes on to say that those born of God cannot sin. Now, this creates an impossible theological paradox. Earlier in the same book, chapter 1 verse 8, he says anyone who claims to be without sin is a liar. But in chapter 3, he says anyone who does sin doesn't know God. This isn't a logical argument, it's a rhetorical trap. By making sin a matter of nature rather than action, he turns every mistake into an identity crisis. Now let's talk about the psychological impact. When sin is an identity, a mistake isn't something you did, it's a revelation of who you are. This leads to a profound fear of exposure and the erasure of the human. If you are born of God, you're expected to be a sinless automation. When you inevitably fail because you are human, the text doesn't offer a way to learn, it offers reason to panic. You begin to wonder, was I ever actually born of God? Am I a child of the devil in disguise? To survive this psychology, you must develop a perfect exterior. You cannot admit the struggle because, in this framework, a struggle isn't a sign of growth, it's a sign of a demonic nature. You are forced to hide your humanity to protect your identity. Now, this creates a community of essentialism. We're no longer a group of people trying to be better, we're a group of essences being sorted. If someone leaves the group or disagrees, as we've already seen, they aren't just wrong, they're revealed to have been of the devil all along. Now, this justifies extreme shunning. You aren't just cutting off a friend, you're purging an alien element. It's impossible to have empathy for someone who is essentialized as evil. When sin becomes identity, the other isn't someone to be understood. They are a different biological category altogether that must be avoided to prevent contamination. In the epistles, you don't commit sin, you become it. In First John, the self is erased and replaced by a status. This is the peak of moral surveillance. You aren't being watched for what you do, you're being watched to see which species you belong to. It turns the church into a sorting facility where the only way to stay safe is to never, ever be human. Now let's talk about authority without verification. This is where we move into the mechanics of the shadows. For a collection of books that demand such absolute transparency from its readers, the general epistles are remarkably opaque about their own origins. In Hebrews and Jude, we see the birth of bureaucratic authoritarianism, power that demands your life but refuses to show its ID. Most of the New Testament leans on a name, Paul, Peter, John, to anchor its claims. But Hebrews is a masterpiece of floating authority. It speaks with the voice of a high priest but provides no return address. Hebrews is ultimately an anonymous sermon that was eventually forced into the canon by tradition. Jude claims a name but relies entirely on the authority of others, the apostles, or even non canonical myths like the Assumption of Moses. The text asserts a divine perspective that transcends the need for a human author. By removing the person, they remove the possibility of a rebuttal. You can argue with Paul because he's a man with a thorn in his flesh. You can't argue with Hebrews because it presents itself as the disembodied voice of truth itself. When authority is divorced from a verifiable human source, the believer undergoes a specific kind of conditioning: trust divorced from evidence. This is epistemic surrender. You're trained to obey not because the argument is sound, but because the tone is authoritative. This creates a psychological blind spot. If the voice sounds holy enough, you stop asking for credentials. Because there is no author to hold accountable, any confusion you have with the text is redirected back onto you. If you don't understand the complex sacrificial logic of Hebrews, it's not because the author is obscure, it's because you are dull of hearing. Hebrews chapter 5 verse 11. This insulates power from accountability. This is the ultimate tool for leadership protection. By using anonymous or borrowed apostolic authority, leaders can issue decrees that no one can trace back to a fallible human being. In a community governed by these texts, the person in charge can say, "The word says," and end the conversation. Since the word in question, like Hebrews, has no historical context or human struggle attached to it, it becomes an unassailable weapon. This gives us control without transparency. It sets a precedent for a top down power structure where the people at the top are stewards of a mystery. You cannot audit a mystery, you cannot cross examine a ghost. This insulates the hierarchy from the consequences of their own instructions. If no one knows who wrote it, no one can question it. By stripping away the human author, these letters achieve a kind of divine plausible deniability. They demand that the believer be fully known, fully transparent, and fully policed, while the authority itself remains hidden behind a veil of sacred anonymity. It is the final step in the surveillance state. The cameras are everywhere and on everybody, but nobody knows who's sitting in the control room. Before we get out of here today, we have to talk about urgency without resolution. In this final section, we look at the temporal trap. The general epistles are written in the meantime, that awkward, agonizing stretch of history where the world was supposed to end, but didn't. To keep the gears of the surveillance state turning, the authors have to maintain a cold red level of urgency in a cold green reality. These epistles are saturated with the language of the last days. However, because they're written decades after the resurrection, they have to pivot from anticipating the end to enforcing the end. In 1 Peter chapter 4 verse 7, the end of all things is near, he says. In 2 Peter chapter 3 verses 10 through 12, the author describes the heavens disappearing with a roar and the elements melting in the heat. These letters provide no roadmap for a long term civilization. There is no plan B for what happens if the sun rises tomorrow, because they assume the clock is at 11:59 p.m. They focus entirely on the short term containment rather than long term flourishing. Living in a state of constant nearness to the apocalypse does something specific to the human brain. It creates chronic anxiety, deferred living. If the end of all things is near, why plant a garden? Why build a library? Why invest in the long term emotional health of your children? You're taught to live in a state of spiritual bags packed, which leads to a profound disconnection from the present moment. In 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 9, it tries to explain the delay by saying God is patient. But for the believer, this delay feels like a never-ending exam. You're forced to maintain a peak level of spiritual intensity indefinitely, which inevitably leads to burnout and disassociation. When a group believes that the end is imminent, they stop caring about the world and start obsessing over the bunker. The community stops asking, how do we make the world a better place? It's already inevitable that it's never going to be better. So the new question becomes, how do we make sure no one leaves before the fires start? This locks the group into a defensive, insular posture. Systematic problems, poverty, injustice, and even the ethics of power are ignored because they require long term, structured thinking. In the general epistles, ethics are reduced to purity policing and loyalty tests because those are the only things that feel urgent in a crisis. When the end doesn't come, fear fills the gap. If the world had ended in 70 AD, these letters might have been seen as final instructions, but because the world kept turning, these final instructions became a permanent grinding pressure. The urgency didn't lead to a resolution, it led to a culture of perpetual panic. By keeping the community in emergency mode, the leaders ensured that no one has the calm or the clarity to question the surveillance system they built. So now that we've made it to our final stop on the journey, let's ask the question that I've been asking all series long. Why can't the general epistles be questioned? Why do these books persist? Well, if they fall, purity policing collapses, moral surveillance weakens, and loyalty tests lose power. Because if you question them, the entire machinery of control collapses. If you admit that James is incoherent or that First John is conditional, then doubt becomes human again, not instability. Suffering becomes a problem to be solved, not proof of holiness. And love becomes an expansive force, not a loyalty test. The general epistles survive because they teach communities how to fear deviation more than harm. We have tracked a transformation that is as subtle as it is devastating. We began with a movement defined by the unsettling presence of the divine and ended up with a manual for institutional preservation. The general epistles are the moment the way became the wall. By the time we close the book on Jude, the spiritual landscape has been fundamentally re engineered. The mind is no longer a place of inquiry, but a potential source of instability. The body is no longer a temple, but a site of display and endurance. And the community is no longer a sanctuary, but a surveillance network, checking for the stains of contamination. The law disciplined bodies, Paul disciplined minds. The general epistles, they discipline belonging itself. They move the goalposts of the spiritual life from transformation to adherence. They teach the believer to scan the horizon for the apocalypse, but more importantly, to scan the person sitting next to them for the first sign of a question. They teach people who is safe, who is dangerous, who is clean, who must be watched. This is not moral guidance, it's community self policing. And once morality becomes surveillance, love becomes conditional, truth becomes dangerous, and obedience becomes the highest good. The tragedy of the general epistles isn't that they failed to save the world from the end, it's that they succeeded in teaching the world how to self destruct by fearing one another. Thank you so much for joining today's conversation. I have one more video that I'm planning on doing for this series, and that'll be, you guessed it, everything wrong with Revelations. We've walked through the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and we're almost completely done with the New Testament. And what a journey this has been. And the good news is, it doesn't have to stop here. If you've enjoyed this series, we're working hard in the background to turn it into a complete course that you can take and experience with others. We're a few weeks away from launch, but if you want a head start, the student workbook for Everything Wrong with Genesis is already available on Windows Shop. It's nearly 60 pages of biblical criticism, psychological insight, sociological implications, additional resources like reading material, and even a glossary of terms for you to expand your vocabulary. Head over to Windows Shop now and download your copy today. All right, that's all I have for now. Until next time, keep rising.